Yeah, it's great pleasure for me to present you all Stephanie Sterma, whom I met at Strelka lectures. She was a lecturer at a terraforming course I was working on, and it was very interesting to dive into the research of Stephanie. I was really impressed by the amount of the world which you actually presented. Like it looked to me very fascinating. So that's why I wanted to invite you to the seminar, network seminar at Center of Research and Interdisciplinarity, and floor is yours. You're right. You feel free to present where you work on now, because I know that you work in different countries. And
yes, of course. Okay, well, thank you so much, Lou. So wonderful to be here with you. I really look forward to sharing this work and getting hearing from you about your feedback and insights. I'm a director, strategist, and writer. And I work at the intersection of all sorts of things: design, urbanism, culture, technology. I'm currently finalizing my PhD at the University of California, San Diego, and in design, kind of traversing fields of speculative design, systems design, and human-centered design, which I'm sort of deconstructing as I'm learning about it. And I both work with Benjamin Bratton at the Center for Design and Geopolitics there. I'm also starting a new role leading the master's course in narrative environments at Central St. Martin's, which is at the University of Arts in London. And I think in general, before I share with you this research, it's kind of good to give you a little bit of a sense of my research in general is always interested in the kind of intersection between systems and speculations. And I'm quite interested in the kind of feedback loops that we get out of material and immaterial surplus. And so the residue of past periods, how that lingers on and how that precludes and prefigures, let's say, certain kinds of social and political orders and possibilities, and how we might mobilize or activate this latency in different kinds of ways. So today I'm going to share with you some thoughts and notes and reflections from a much larger book project in the works called Auto, a platform parable. And it's this idea of the Autocene, which is a period that I'm sort of coining just as a way of starting to think about this epoch of automobility and platform automation, and start to think about how we should design it forward. So I'll just say, as I start, feel free to stop me and have that conversation. I probably won't notice if you put something in the chat because I'm going to be sharing, but feel free to just call out and we can pause and clarify or what have you. Okay, great. So, and I'm also driving on 2 screens, so I apologize if there's some latency there. Okay, so in recent years, scientists have been debating just when to locate the golden spike of the Anthropocene, attempting to indicate a single turning point when humans have had an irreversible effect on planetary, geological, chemical, and biological processes, crossing the threshold from the Holocene period to an altogether different paradigm. Paleo climate, it's been a topic of substantial debate. Paleoclimatologist William Rudiman has pushed for starting the Anthropocene when humans first began terrascaping the Earth with agriculture thousands of years ago, or when they wiped out, or when they wiped out the megafauna of Australia and North America thousands of years ago. Others argue that the onset of the Industrial Revolution and Watt's steam engine invention should be the marker, where the charts reflect an early uptick of carbon output. And others have argued against designating the Anthropocene a distinct period at all, given that the Holocene has been marked by escalating human influences since the end of the Ice Age. The golden spike has been placed by scientists in the mid-20th century at the start of a period called the Great Acceleration, a period that begins just after World War II, when the growing population began consuming resources and creating completely new materials at an exponential rate, eclipsing the Industrial Revolution. And the catalytic event of this is pinned at the Trinity test, which was the first detonation of a nuclear device in 1945 in the Muerto Desert in New Mexico, whose residue poured unprecedented amounts of organic pollutants into the environment. Now, 1945 happens to also be the same year when code-breaking experiments started to merge with electrified computation, and women who had long done math and science calculations in everything from astronomy to ballistics, known as computers, started to become programmers of ENIAC, shifting from manual to digital calculations. And the first Macy conferences on cybernetics were also at this time. And Norbert Wiener famously first used the term feedback, input, and output to describe engineering processes. And he introduced the lexicon of the science of communication and control, concerned especially with the study of automatic control systems, linking the dynamics of nervous system and brain to mechanical electrical communication. That same year, the term automation was coined at the Ford Motor Company by VP of Manufacturing Delbert Harder. At Ford, they called it transfer automation, which meant that humans were no longer needed to man the movement of products from one machine to another. And at Ford, they understood it as an extension of the Ford process of mass mechanization that had been a hallmark of the company since its famous assembly line. At the same time, Harvard management consultant John Diebold also coined the term, supposedly, and he argued, unlike the folks at Ford Motors, that automation marked a distinct break from the mechanization that came before. As he saw it, automation marked a distinctive rupture in the human labor trajectory. Humans now would act as designers, supervisors, maintainers, programmers, but their absence from the mechanics of routine machine operations or processing meant a fundamentally different paradigm. So what I want to talk about today is this idea of the Autocene and how this period before the Great Acceleration, which is entangled with the coming of age of the Anthropocene, we can think about as the early Autocene, no matter where we kind of decide to put these markers. And I also want to think about how Ford and Henry Ford and this period of Fordism, or what I like to think more about as the Fordian, is also characteristic of what we can think about as an early rise of platform automation and platform automobility, and how that kind of shapes the way we think about platform automobility today. So one of the ways to think about this is something that geographer Ronald Hovrath called machine space, which is kind of the amount of planetary space that is simply dedicated to cars. And it's not only just like roads or the passages of the network, but it's also the space devoted to driving, parking, maintenance. And it's like an incredible portion. In some cities, it's 50% of land mass is actually devoted to this machine. And if you look at the planet in this way, it's almost like the planet already appears as a ruin. Like we're post facto, we've already destroyed in some way so much of it. And this one easy culprit, let's think about, is the automobile. But it also kind of accelerated the Anthropocene. It gave way and enabled humans' expansion to all of the most remote corners of the earth. And it shaped the kind of species and what was allowed to both live within the land areas that it divided up and what was enabled to traverse it. Of course, it also changed dramatically human space-time, how we live, move, work, have sex, how we organize economies around machines, how we shape and measure GDP and growth. It's the automobile manufacturer is kind of the go-to symbol of this. The many wars, as we all know, and the meaning of autonomy as we inherited. And I think with the rise of autonomous vehicles and the kind of both the pragmatics that come along with it and the absurdities that are coming along with it, we have this really incredible but complicated opening in which we can sort of describe and rethink this trajectory. And as we look at the kind of the systems effects, like the lock-in and emergent effects that have come in its prehistory, we can think about the Autocene to come. And as I think about it, it's not as much only about the infrastructural territorialization of this machine space that we have, but it's also this kind of trauma of automobility. And so what I've been thinking about is if the Anthropocene describes the epoch in which man fundamentally changed the world by putting himself at the center of the universe, fulfilling his needs and wishes at the behest of the planet and its multiple species, then it's also during this period that man, in pursuing his fulfillment of desires via machine space, unwittingly designed himself out of it. And so man thought he was designing the world for man, but actually was designing the planet for machines. And so this is this kind of incredible psychodynamic contradiction and political contradiction in socio-technical development and human-machine interaction. And what I want to sort of argue is that a lot of the things that we talk about that are new or emergent phenomenon related to platform computation or the debates around automation today really have a much longer historic trajectory. And I think we can kind of reshift how we think about them less as an automotive or a self-intention and more about a kind of momentum that is a factor of emergent systems and the forces of, and those are the forces of technological change with which we might need to contend. So first, a little history of the auto, which is a wonderful way of deconstructing and getting to understand the machine and the car. So automata, which are these marvelous things that seem to move on their own, have been around since antiquity. Clocks, figurines, all kinds of mobiles, and automata were designed to move without human intervention, and they were fantastic and illusory, but one of their features is that automata conceal the human work that determines the directives and decisions of their mechanisms. They're pre-programmed. And it's not only the immediate human labor, but automata also conceal the fact that their energetic source of power or motion comes from beyond itself. So even if the processing mechanism is within, there's a whole other system of power that comes without. And so you have this auto implying self-regulation, self-processing, self-determination, self-operation, but it's all contingent always on some illusion of autonomy, an illusion of an interdependence from the broader system upon which it is contingent. And the automobile, of course, was named as such because it shifted the source of energy power generated by the horse to the carriage, which drew the carriage to the cart, or the car for short. And so it carries the processing power within itself, but of course, it's limited by its storage capacity. And for me, nowhere is this kind of slow history of automation, not automation as something radical, but actually something as iterative, embedded then inside the car itself, because all of the decisions that a driver used to make, from shifting to locking to braking to cruise control to windows, is now part of the operations of the car. And so as drivers, we've been slowly over time performing less and less manual functions and giving way to the car so that we might do other things. This sometimes when there's contemporary conversations and concerns around de-skilling, I think about how wonderful it is that we don't all have to open up our hood and know how to fix our own engines, that we have mechanics to do that. And to some degree, we've been able to specialize around these kinds of things and freeing up our time to do other sorts of things. And of course, there's also considerations around governance and the autopoetic. Sociologist John Urry argues that the automobile proliferated across the planet autopoetically, and that we didn't actually design an infrastructure or have a plan for how it would work. And this is not only kind of the larger spatial trajectory of the planet, but it's also part of how we think about traffic management, and both the traffic management we have and the future to come. And so it also is demonstrative of the incredible way that we don't always need top-down coordination or mediation to allow movement in large systems to occur. And in some ways, maybe the traffic light is an emblematic example of governance proper, regulation of autonomy, but also our kind of collective acceptance that in many countries, it is a welcome constraint to the complete freedom of the automobile to have a traffic light that manages to mediate between these systems, and that constraint on freedom is welcome. Now, the term automation was coined by Ford, but it was coined in an act of shortening from automatization, which was at the time referred to the process of making something more automatic than it was before. And as I see it, this is exactly what's happening today with the idea of platformization, which is the kind exactly in the rhetoric and discourse. And what I think is so interesting about the Fordist legacy is it also contains this question of platformation, as I like to think about, or the becoming platform of things, not only as an intensification, but as a much longer process. And so what some of this work does is really trace the idea of the platform and the individual platform back to the platform chassis in the car, which is kind of your fundamental foundation that plays a really specific role in this genealogy, because it is the thing that allows for the Ford Model T to create all these new platform logics, as I like to think about: production, commercialization, circulation, standardization, all a kind of choreography. And if you're familiar with a kind of broader automotive history, GM really took up this idea of a platform logic, which said, okay, we're going to have one standardized base that we produce, and then we can kind of disperse it to various places across the globe, and they will adapt the model or the design to the various cultural contexts in which it operates. And we can think about this kind of as a platform stack, so to speak. So you have like the Model T, which is the personal device. And most people don't really realize, but you could get the Model T, and there was many different versions. It was just really the chassis and the foundation that was the thing that was the most standardized. And people adapted this platform in all sorts of ways to do many different things with it. And there was a planetary engine, which was really originally designed for interoperability, which is also a platform strategy that we see happening a lot. Of course, another component in the platform stack is moving or mobile mass production, which relies on motorized conveyance and standardized parts with low tolerance for variation. Infinitely substitutable unskilled labor. As some of my research also looks into, I think generally thinking about platforms as having both a horizontal and a vertical strategy. And so we associate Ford most commonly with vertical integration, but there's actually lots of ways in which Ford was looking to create kind of village industries and smaller scale suppliers, some independent, some in-house, all over the world, to allow to maximize production. And always used river networks because they provided more readily planetary access at the time that it was being created than the roads which were happening as a result of the automotive transformation. Also, as a platform strategy, Ford was always interested in circumnavigating all sorts of things, from taxes to resources, assembly, and sales. And had also a quite interesting way of using all the pieces. So these are knockdown kits, which were like then shipped to different countries and reassembled. And everything, including the box, was part of this system strategy that Ford developed. Another strategy for Ford was almost like an open source and open data almost policy on things. So there was constantly manuals being created. There was very few trade secrets. He constantly hosted factory tours and invited global visitors in to kind of gain insight to modify his inventions. And I think that the strategy responded to two things that I think most designers today don't really think about in terms of mobility, which is responding both to need and desire. So it wasn't one or the other. So in the US, for rural communities, the car and its associations with the tractor was completely responding to a need. I mean, more people had a Model T than a bathtub in 1913. And at the same time, there needed to be this whole other way of creating demand for the car within cities around the publicity dimension of the platform stack, let's say. And so Ford also used the dealership networks that he had also as media outlets, and the media outlets as sales devices. So both for circulating and increasingly populist and fascist ideology. But also maybe lesser known and in some ways much more impressively, Ford had the biggest motion picture unit of any industry at the time. And so pretty much from the onset of the assembly line on was filming and circulating all of the production and the production of the car, but then became a sort of staple in cinemas and movie houses. So if you went to see a movie at the time, you would see Ford produced sponsored newsreels, which were sort of this early form of product placement. And so really integrating the trajectory of the car and the trajectory of the cinema are really one and the same. And you're probably familiar with this, maybe the most famous quote from Ford, which is both a wonderful quip about how unnecessary choice is, but also this changed in 1914, and you could, in fact, have gotten the Model T in many colors before then, and there was lots of choice. But as the assembly line production ramped up, at the exact same time that the cinema production was ramping up, black became the only choice, both because paint dries faster, but also because it created a seamless relationship between the reality in the cinema and the reality of the movie screen. The other thing that happened is this kind of enclosure of nature. So Ford, Thomas Edison, Henry Firestone, the tire maker, and the naturalist John Burroughs, like famously went on these adventure tours and these trips back to the land, wilderness, to kind of live out the life that they were manufacturing out of civilization in some ways. And all of these trips were recorded, and inevitably they became so widespread through these movie reels and so popular that they couldn't even go on the trips anymore. So it's this constant, the automobile is this constant process of undoing the very things that it in some ways enables and hopes to chase after. In the same way that roads were at least in the US, really initiated by this good roads movement, which was farmers and bicyclists arguing that they needed paved roads rather than stone roads to be able to move around the world seamlessly, but then of course got completely nudged out of the equation as the car came in. Now, it's also interesting to note in terms of manufacturing and work that the platform itself is the first part of the car to be completely automated. So even as early as 1920, you had a complete automation of this part of the car. And it's worth noting again that, of course, like, before the assembly line, you had about a bunch of men, and it took about 8 hours to assemble the car at once. But with moving a conveyance, as you know, everyone stood still. And there's this great saying that they said the future came to you, so that the cars rolled down the line and men were completely stable. And Jeffrey Eugenides in Middlesex argues that this was really when men stopped being human in a way and started becoming something else entirely. And in some ways we can think about this as a complete inversion of rotation and almost a Copernican revolution in and of itself, because it meant that men were now the appendage to this much broader coordinated machine, which McLuhan called them the reproductive organs of the factory. And the other thing I think that's really, in terms of the Autocene, that's important to think about is it's more, I think about it as it's more that men were performing or playing the role of the robots that were on their way to becoming. So it's not that men were being turned into machines, it's that they were performing this role that would ultimately actually be able to be inhabited by the machines. And maybe this is the way that Charles Babbage thought about it too. So before kind of studying the computer and working on codes, he first studied manufacturing and studied the factory as the physical embodiment of mathematical principles, and sort of looked at how time and divisions of labor were really the beginning of computational logics, the separation of components that would be programmed into a larger whole and then choreographed and coordinated to allow for certain operations. And this is exactly kind of what happened later, swapping men performing the role of machines into machines themselves. But of course, this is never completely eliminated from the whole operation, from the planetary perspective, from the, if you want to think about the iPhone as an update to the Model T, that's a pretty good way to think about kind of a single personal device that all of a sudden became ubiquitous and became connected. Every person had this extension or this appendage, but that there's this incredible dependency at various levels of the production process between humans and machines. And of course, it also has to do with work and the relationships of work. So what is perhaps unusual about Ford that we don't see in the same platform dynamics is this $5 a day. And so part of the reason Ford's became so popular is that he offered this incredibly high wage to workers. And Antonio Gramsci wrote about how this actually enabled the workers to eventually afford the cars that they were producing. And he saw this as like a first step on the path towards communism in a totally other configuration of society, which, as did Lenin and Stalin and the whole Soviet Union, was also an incredible fan of Ford and Ford production methods, which they used completely differently. So there, instead of manufacturing automobiles for individual users, the Soviet Union bought up lots of Ford equipment. And Albert Kahn, Ford's architect, has spent most of the 1930s working in the Soviet Union, designing factories in other spaces. But these factories were really building tractors and trucks. And so the same architecture that was used to kind of create this individual apparatus was used to create a whole other collective means of production and acceleration. The assembly line also, perhaps counterintuitively to the ways that we think about work, the assembly line meant the introduction of a shorter workday, which was said to both produce a more productive workforce, but it also opened up weekend time. And that weekend time meant that people wanted to take their car and go out to the country, so it incentivized buying. Of course, the other option, if you didn't go out to the country with your car, you went to the amusement park, and the amusement park sort of reproduced this idea of transportation, but again with a more stable body and the machine relocating you around. And most amusement parks were incredibly pedestrian, so taking the mobile out of the equation and kind of building a fantasy around, let's call it, transportation without destination. It's also the case that Ford is also often used almost interchangeably with Taylor and scientific management. And I think the ideas about surveillance capitalism that circulate so much today is thinking about the invasion of tracking and kind of this very detailed look at worker time. But it's quite interesting to me that Ford's team really didn't like Taylor and thought, they said that Taylor was always refining processes that didn't need to be there in the first place. And so this idea of Taylor as this kind of tweaking management consultant that's always tweaking the operations rather than thinking really systemically and holistically about the whole thing and the whole process. And I wish I had time to tell you all of these strange stories about the Fordian Autocene, from deep in the Amazon jungle to the first airport in Dearborn. But I think it's clear from the whole history that the Model T and Ford's kind of the planetary proliferation of it, the ambition was not to build a car, but to really reorganize the world under a mobility paradigm. But in designing this device for individuals, it also means that Ford deconstructs the values that he holds so dear. And so at the end of his life, he ends up really building a simulation of the cities that he grew up in and that his invention destroyed. So if you've ever been to Dearborn, Michigan, you can go to Greenfield Village, where Ford collects sites of innovation, Edison's factory, the Wright brothers bicycle workshop. And it's a very similar an amusement park and a testament of like an amusement park of innovation to the without any of the things that these technological innovations brought. A simulated city, we could think about it as almost an example of what Zuckerberg's Zucktown or Google's Sidewalk Labs in some ways hope to do. And they're almost these kind of guilty microcosms of the time before their inventions proliferated, and in which there's also this kind of strange return to micro scale. So they all of these inventions start by having incredible planetary platform access and reach, and then they reduce back to the neighborhood. Okay, so what does this all mean for the Autocene forward and cities forward? So I guess I found this in the Ford archives, but I think it's so perfect in terms of autonomous cars and maybe the promises and psychopathologies that we have around them and around their development, because you have this kind of seduction of the human in the loop, but also as the ad suggests, you, the individual driver, will still be at the center of the car's thoughts. And if we had in this day like that, the combination of Ford's platform was both this combination of the internal combustion engine and electricity and mass assembly and publicity. Now we have, of course, in autonomous vehicles, GPS and mobile phones and electric batteries and AI and sensors and pattern recognition and all of these things that are changing communication, navigation, and transportation all at once. It seems that cars are increasingly pieces of mobile media. If they were kind of a central device for this in Ford's day of kind of integrating the cinema and the car, now they are in some ways also pieces of cinema. And as we like to think about it at the design lab, they're also becoming more robots than machines. And it seems like there's some pretty important psychological and philosophical paradigms around that. So one of the projects that we're working on is also thinking about in this transition how humans and cars will communicate with one another and talk to one another, and what is the right interface for them to be negotiating who is driving at any given time in kind of level 3 and 4 automation. And one of the things I think a lot about is the role of the city in all of this. You might be familiar with Leonardo da Vinci's Automata, often cited as the first self-driving car. And it was really a little cart with a wind-up mechanism that navigated the streets of Florence. What's really interesting to me about this is that Florence had one-way streets. And so what really enabled da Vinci to create this device was this constraint of a single turn. And so fewer decisions allow for autonomy or autonomousness to move and progress faster. And I think it's quite a lesson for today. And of course, we've been working on autonomous cars for quite a long time, from this radio car with Houdini and the idea of a remote control kind of car, to experiments in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and also things in the 90s where the plan sort of was that we would automate highway systems rather than individual cars, which now perhaps seems absurd today, but that was sort of the plan. Now, for me, what isn't resolved in a lot of the imaginations of the industry is this, which thinking about the car as a geometry problem, not as a computational problem, so to speak. And we're very used to images like this, which kind of offer these mobility futures. But I think that actually what's more important than the autonomous car is the ways that rideshare and mobile phones are actually providing for post-ownership coordination. And so if you look back at the kind of the Fordist intervention and revolution in mobility systems, it was really about an economic model of just making it so much more affordable than any other option on the market that allowed for this proliferation. And I'm sort of in the camp that it will be the same thing. The moment that rideshare is cheaper and more convenient than anything else, which has as much to do with paying drivers as it does about pricing externalities outside the system that allow for those other features to be part of the calculation, then rideshare will be the way. And of course, Elon Musk is our contemporary foil to Ford, and he's doing all sorts of things that both copy his genius and his incredible lack of imagination and capacity. So you have Elon Musk creating tunnels for cars that are just as useful for trains or something like this. And for me, this is also something that should go into our thoughts and considerations around cities, where the idea of redesigning the car rather than redesigning the city so that autonomous cars will come in is probably the wrong way to think about it. This is also consistent with what went on in the unfortunate death of Elaine Hertzberg in Arizona, and it's notable that her family sued not Uber and the driver that failed to supervise her, but the city of Tempe, Arizona, where the death occurred, because Elaine tried to cross the street at an intersection where there was a dip in the road, thinking that that was a safe place to cross. And so the lack of infrastructure around other mobility modes that the car completely dominated is part of this concern. I'm going to skip forward just so we have some time to discuss at the end, share a few other last concepts with you. Of course, one of the other things that we're thinking about the Autocene is the role of policy and labor and regulation in labor and automation. And in what ways can we actually intervene in this system without some sort of much more radical overhaul of the economic systems? And one of the ways we started to think about this is around this question of co-piloting and remote driving, which is becoming ever more prominent and popular. And we did this residency, which was really concerned about the loss of jobs for drivers. And the question was around trucking and labor. So how can we ensure a kind of just transition for truckers that are being outmoded by AI driving, et cetera. And what we proposed is an AI driver's license and digital vehicle registration. So instead of less tracking, actually more tracking of where AI drivers are and where human drivers are at any moment could enable a policy mechanism both to account for labor that's going on from one country to another, but also to kind of allow for this co-piloting and to understand the kind of ecological effects and economic effects that go on at any given time in mobility space. And of course, like the highways are already they're complete machine spaces. I mean, they are the kind of manifestation of this. And in some ways, this is the idea that like these mechanisms for tracing both carbon and planning and traffic control can also be useful in nudging the city as well as kind of the new technology towards mutually coefficient ends. And so last, I think there's this other thing going on in these conversations around the introduction of autonomous vehicles, which is a much more pronounced psychodynamic dimension, which is really grappling with the death of the operator and this kind of like existential question that it leaves us as humans in after modernity about the like what it is to relinquish manual control. And no event is more perfect than around this question than the novelist J.G. Ballard, who wrote a book called The Atrocity Exhibition, which then resulted in an exhibition at New Arts Laboratory London, where he staged an exhibition with three crashed cars that he brought into the gallery. And famously, that exhibition got completely debaucherous. It was ridiculous. Things were smashed, people were assaulted, and Ballard thought it just was totally emblematic of the entire system, the automotive system in which we find itself. You may have seen the Cronenberg movie Crash, in which a group of people share a sexual fetish for car accidents. And in a way, it's this totally exquisite analysis of how to contend, of a group of people trying to contend with the social psychoses around the questions of control in the automobile, but also in the auto more broadly. I think because both every single car trip is itself a flirtation with and a deviation of the personal death drive and an acceleration of the collective death drive. But it also kind of is this way of admitting or contending with the fact that control has already been lost in that respect. And so in the film, the kind of subjects replay the machinic trauma as an act of pleasure. And I suppose if there's any mandate for art in the Autocene, it's this, to organize the means for capturing and channeling residual perversions. And so this delusion of control, this obsession with atomized individual momentum, the sensations of liberal autonomy might be channeled into other kinds of platforms that pool and exacerbate social and collective desire. Of course, other forms of renegotiating the surplus, this failed infrastructure. There's lots of talk about taking down highways now, but I think that repurposing them, converting them, perverting the kind of infrastructures is a much more interesting and probably liberatory way to contend with some of this stuff than to destroy it totally. And it's really about this question of freedom. So a device like this speed limiter in the early 90s that could be installed on cars that could limit your speed within never took hold, because we don't think about our personal device as being the arrangement where governance should happen. It should always be at the scale of the city or something like this. And this totally trickles over into the ideology of Tesla, where we're back at this idea of now that we have electrified vehicles, somehow we'll be liberated from autonomy and given the freedom of the freedom to roam the planet as if it's back in its completely natural state. I think in conclusion, there's really two things here. What we want is a multi-species ecology of vehicles. And so the very kind of standardized platform chassis that Ford locked us into without ownership is the exact opposite of what we really want to see in urban spaces. We want a completely, so it's self-driving vehicles in the true sense of vehicles, as in all kinds of mobility modes, not like ridding our imagination that means car. And that the kind of pathology is this association that we are still making. And I think the other thing that we'll have to do is deal with how driving is itself an unconscious process that actually allows us to move in space and think in a different kind of way. And when that role of the driver, the operator, disappears, I think we're also losing a way that we're used to contending with an unconscious space and thinking through and working through an unconscious space of thought that we don't often pay attention to. And so I think that's why we're kind of like holding on to this question of humans as replacement for work, rather than thinking about the whole system and context in which human labor is honored and life is supported and so on. But I think it's really this idea of dealing with the fact that we're confronting the fact that we don't have control over the control we thought we had, and that we've been asleep at the wheel and unconscious the whole time, is the core conundrum in sort of how we design for the Autocene to come. Yeah, so thank you very much. And I will stop sharing.